You're not misunderstood. You're unclear. And if you're a 90s kid, that's not accidental. You think people understand you, they don't. You think you're being clear, you're not. Your no almost never sounds like no. It sounds like maybe. We'll see, I'm not sure. That could work. If you want, I guess. And you assume the other person knows what that means. They don't. They hear possibility. You mean resistance. They hear openness. You mean hesitation. They hear agreement. You mean stop. And when they move forward confidently, you feel ignored. But you never actually said no. That gap between what you meant and what you said is where resentment starts. And resentment builds quietly. 90s kids don't say what they mean directly. They cushion it, they soften it, they dilute it just enough to avoid friction, and then they expect precision from the other person. Why? Because you weren't raised to express conflict. You were raised to manage it. You grew up in homes where tension didn't explode. It hovered. Conversations didn't end in shouting. They ended in silence. Energy shifted. Tone changed slightly. Doors closed a little quieter. And you learned something subtle. Harmony keeps you safe. And harmony requires soft edges. So you built a communication style around cushioning impact. Instead of saying, "No, I don't want that," you say, "I'm not sure that's the best idea." Instead of saying, "That bothered me," you say, "It's fine." Instead of saying, "I disagree," you say, "That's interesting." You're not lying, you're buffering. You're editing intensity before it leaves your mouth, because directness feels risky. Risk of escalation, risk of rejection, risk of destabilizing the relationship, so you leave space. Space to adjust, space to retreat, space to reinterpret later. And that feels intelligent, it feels emotionally aware, it feels mature. But kindness without clarity creates instability. When words don't match position, people guess, and guessing creates error. You think you're avoiding conflict, you're creating confusion instead. Here's the uncomfortable mirror. You resent people for not reading signals you deliberately blurred. You expect nuance detection, you expect sensitivity, you expect emotional intelligence. But you rarely offer direct data. And when they misinterpret you, it reinforces the belief that people don't get you. But they're responding to what you said, not what you meant. And that's the pattern. This isn't weakness, it's adaptation. But adaptation doesn't mean it's harmless. Because every time you soften a clear position, you trade short-term harmony for long-term misunderstanding. And that trade adds up. Now here's where this shifts. 90s kids don't avoid conflict, they delay it. And delay feels responsible. It feels mature. It feels controlled. But delay changes the chemistry of the conversation, because while you're waiting, you're accumulating. You absorb frustration. You replay tone. You analyze intention. You reinterpret sentences long after the moment passed. You tell yourself it's not worth it. You tell yourself this isn't the right time. You tell yourself you'll bring it up later. But later isn't neutral. Later is layered. By the time you finally speak, it's no longer one issue, it's five. 5 small moments stacked together. 5 microsignals you never clarified. 5 quiet disappointments you never named. And the other person doesn't know that. From their perspective, nothing was wrong yesterday. Nothing was wrong last week. You were fine. Your tone was steady. Your responses were normal. Your words were soft. So when tension finally surfaces, it feels sudden. To them, it feels like overreaction. To you, it feels overdue. That mismatch is the cost of postponement. You think you're preventing drama. You're building surprise. And surprise destabilizes trust. Here's the sharper layer. When you don't state dissatisfaction directly, you adjust behavior instead. You reply slower. You shorten responses. You lower warmth. You reduce enthusiasm. You create subtle distance. And you expect the other person to notice. When they don't, you feel unseen. But you never name the shift. You signaled it. Signaling is not stating, and statements are what create alignment. This is where emotional intelligence quietly becomes emotional management. You're regulating the room, regulating tone, regulating perception. But regulation is not clarity. And clarity is what relationships stabilize around. Here's the uncomfortable part. Delayed conflict feels morally superior. It feels calmer, less reactive, more thoughtful. But sometimes it's just fear of immediate exposure. Because early conflict requires one thing: direct positioning. I don't agree. I don't want this. That doesn't work for me. Those sentences remove flexibility, and flexibility feels safer. If you never fully state your position, you never fully risk rejection. You never fully risk being wrong. You never fully risk confrontation. But the trade-off is clarity. And without clarity, relationships operate on inference. Inference creates error. Error creates tension. And tension eventually forces confrontation anyway. Only now it's heavier. Now it carries history. Now it carries resentment. Now it carries surprise. You didn't avoid conflict. You postponed it until it had weight. And weight changes tone. That's why your calm delivery can feel intense to other people. Because what you're expressing isn't just today, it's accumulation. And accumulation without transparency creates imbalance. You call it patience. Other people experience it as unpredictability. And unpredictability erodes stability. Because people don't know where they stand. And when people don't know where they stand, they adjust defensively. Not because you're aggressive, but because you're unclear. And that's where the real cost begins. Now here's where this gets uncomfortable. Indirect language doesn't just soften conflict. It preserves exit routes. You rarely say something that locks you into one clear position. You leave space, you add qualifiers, you lower certainty, you insert ambiguity, not randomly, consistently. You say, I'm not totally against it. Maybe. That could work. If that's what you want. Each phrase creates flexibility. If the outcome is good, you were supportive. If it's bad, you were cautious. You were never fully committed. You were never fully opposed. You stayed adjustable. That's not accidental. That's plausible deniability. And it feels intelligent because you're never fully exposed. If someone reacts negatively, you can soften retroactively. That's not what I meant. If someone agrees, you can strengthen your stance. Yeah, that's what I was saying. Your language stays movable. Movable positions feel safe, because fixed positions invite opposition. But here's the cost. When your position is unclear, other people hesitate. When people hesitate, momentum slows. When momentum slows, frustration builds. Eventually, someone asks directly, "What do you actually want? Are you committed? What do you really think?" And that's the moment ambiguity collapses, because you can't respond to that with maybe. You either step forward or reveal you were never fully there. This is why the pattern creates friction, not because you're dramatic, not because you're explosive, but because you're strategically unclear. And strategic uncertainty erodes trust. People don't trust tone. They trust position. They trust clarity. They trust knowing where they stand. If they constantly have to interpret you, they get tired. Interpretation is work. Work creates strain. Strain creates distance. And distance feels like disconnection. You believe you're preserving connection. But sometimes you're preserving flexibility instead. And flexibility is not commitment. Here's the real mirror. If someone consistently can't tell what you mean, is that their lack of emotional intelligence? Or your refusal to risk directness? If your maybe regularly hides a no, is that kindness? Or avoidance disguised as politeness? If you delay clarity until tension forces it out, is that maturity? Or fear of early exposure? You don't explode. You don't dominate. You don't overshare. You edit. You soften. You delay. You protect optionality. But optionality prevents stability. Because stability requires position. And position requires risk. So here's the final tension. Is indirectness emotional intelligence? Or fear of being fully accountable for what you want? If clarity makes you vulnerable, but ambiguity makes others uncertain, which one damages connection more? And if you had to choose between being liked in the moment or being clear long term? Which one are you actually choosing?